Happy to be here today with Raghav Chawla from Fidelity, yeah, from our side. And why don't you, if you don't mind, give us a few minutes of a background on where you come from and where you see, or specifically where your division maybe in Fidelity got started.
Sure, yeah, and thank you so much for having me today. So yeah, my background, so my formal education is in electrical engineering, where I specialized in networking protocols, and I also minored in finance. But like most people in my generation, my real education was on the internet, kind of exploring various interests like, behavioral economics and game theory and complex systems, which fortunately, a lot of those nerdy interests actually are quite relevant in the blockchain world. And so I was always interested in future technologies, and I actually first learned about Bitcoin back in 2009. I still wish I had started mining back then. But initially my interest was, more from the technology side and microtransactions and whatnot. And it wasn't until probably 2012, 2013 when the macroeconomic implications of that really hit me. And then I was like really all in. And at the time I was leading our enterprise innovation program within Fidelity Investments. And so I used to keep, I just talked to a lot of senior leaders across different parts of the firm. And I used to keep saying that we're talking about innovation in financial services. We got to do something with Bitcoin and blockchain technologies and stuff. And so eventually I helped the head of our R&D organization, which is what I'm currently part of as well. We call it the Fidelity Center for Applied Technology. So I helped him prepare this presentation on Bitcoin, which he then presented to our CEO, Abby Johnson. And she was kind of all over it immediately. I think a lot of people don't realize the history of innovation Fidelity has. We spend over $2 billion a year in technology. We're very technology focused, and we're very, looking out into the future always. Fidelity had the first, or one of the first 1-800 numbers for a financial services company to sell stocks over the phone. We were the first 401k provider to actually have a website back when the internet was this newfangled thing. And so when this Bitcoin thing came along, we immediately kind of put a team together. And actually a lot of the people that were part of the early internet days, and they were kind of building their own browser to get a handle on what the internet is and how we might be able to use it. They were part of our blockchain incubator, as we called it as well. And so one of the first things we did, so I actually built a mining operation because, again, we wanted to start at the foundational level of these technologies. So I built this Bitcoin mining operation that's still operational. And we did a whole bunch of other stuff as well, like so Fidelity Charitable, which is one of the largest charitable organizations in the US. We started accepting Bitcoin and Ethereum donations there. We've raised over $100 million for charity through that avenue. We also allowed people to see their Coinbase balances on Fidelity.com so that they can get a full picture of the financial, crypto as well as traditional. And we also allowed people to buy their lunches in our cafeterias with Bitcoin. Again, with the idea being to enable this sort of minimal viable ecosystem to see, how people use these technologies and whatnot. So this, I'm talking like this was like early 2015 when all of this.
Those were some expensive lunches, very, very expensive.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people. So that was one of our first learnings, right? Like nobody wants to spend this because, like, but yeah. So that was back in 2015, and that's where we got started. We built a wallet as well, again, just to get a handle on the foundational level of the technology, and we're still continuing, experimenting in the space and learning, and it's such a fast-moving space with so much happening, and it's super exciting.
It's really great to hear. I think so much of this community thinks that it's, and it is important that we have so many like entrepreneurial people and small groups and small teams and one-man shops sometimes, but people don't realize that there's also these amazing things that are happening in the enterprise space, and that people are, I think, very sneakily, Fidelity is actually probably one of the larger custodians out there. I mean, there's little things that you guys are doing left and right that maybe you might not be as loud about. So it's great to hear that there's innovation happening. It's great to hear that you guys are being funded and you've got some fun stuff and some projects you're working on. So I guess one of the goals in this session would be kind of maybe share some of that, right? Our community, largely developers, the folks that are probably listening in right now are largely people who are trying to build the next gen apps, and they'd love to hear maybe some of the stuff that you're working on that maybe they eventually can tack their IP on top of in the future.
Sure, absolutely, and we're constantly experimenting. We truly believe in learning by doing, and so We like to build stuff, so we build a lot of stuff. Although most of the stuff that we build doesn't see the light of day, but they're great learning for us. We look at everything from like the cryptographic primitives that enable some of these technologies to exist in the first place, to like the actual blockchain protocols, to the applications, whether decentralized applications or centralized applications that are leveraging these different blockchains protocols out there, as well as all this new stuff around DeFi and all those types of protocols, as well as kind of beyond just the pure financial services side of things. I mean, we look at governance models and crypto economic models and self-sovereign identity, which is actually a huge area of interest for me personally. So we definitely have a broad purview on the space, and even within the use cases that we look at, they're primarily financial services focused, but even go beyond there as well. We look at stuff in healthcare and other areas as well. And they could be, small feature enhancements, or maybe some back office efficiency sort of potential, or all the way to entirely new products, services, and even, entirely new companies. So to tell you a little bit about a few things that we can, that we have publicly released recently. One of them, so again, you can probably get a sense of the different scale that we operate in as well. So one, there's an application actually in the Apple App Store right now called the Digital Asset Tracker, which is something that I actually built, which is basically a portfolio manager app for your cryptos. And that is the super experimental, not polished at all, kind of alpha release, just to play around with something that's out there. Beyond that, we have something that we recently launched. It's a product called Sherlock, which is a data product. And that's kind of like the Bloomberg for crypto for all your data needs in the crypto world. And that's a real product with real paying customers out there. It's still housed within our lab, but perhaps in the future it grows up and kind of becomes its own entity or gets absorbed by another part of the currently existing business units within Fidelity. And then beyond that, there's something that you probably have heard about the most, which is the Fidelity Digital Asset Services business. And that's an entirely new company that we spun out. It also started as a small experiment within our lab. But now that's its own company with serving institutional clients for their crypto custody needs as well as trade execution needs.
That's fantastic. And I'm just kind of curious. It's one thing to build, some of these projects, and I guess a few of them will grow up and then become, part of your real digital asset business effectively, right? So it's this kind of a skunkworks operation. You play around with some things, like you said, and then some of them graduate into the digital assets.
Exactly, absolutely, right. So again, we kind of follow our interests, monitor the space, start exploring, start building, and like I said, some of the stuff is just building to learn, and then some of the stuff is maybe aligned with one of our existing business lines, and so we kind of work, with some of our existing businesses as well to see how these technologies might play to benefit them, whether it's just increasing efficiency or potentially new revenue streams, all the way to small products and standalone products and services, all the way up to entirely new companies. So absolutely, we play at that broad scale.
All right, so here's the $10,000 question. You guys are massive. You are a centralized entity, generally speaking, and we're talking about a decentralized world. So really curious, how do these things play together? How is blockchain and decentralization going to impact financial services? And how does that play nicely, with centralized? Obviously you must think that, and that's why you're investing in this area, but I'm really curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it plays an extremely important role. So if you think about like the financial system that exists today, it was built over decades. New technologies came online, which were absorbed in. New regulations came to be, and which you had to comply with. And so there's all these systems built with various technologies, kind of trying to talk to each other, as well as a whole bunch of intermediary institutions that were created to fulfill some service. And what blockchains and decentralized infrastructure can do is actually bring in a whole lot of efficiencies to the space in various ways, from technology standpoint. The one famous example to kind of illustrate what I mean by that is you have the DTCC, where you have all these individual financial institutions maintaining their databases, and then they whenever trades occur, they send information over to DTCC, and then it goes through the clearing and settlement processes. It takes a couple of days, and then the that there's reconciliation efforts because everybody has to have the same source of truth. And so a lot of time and effort and money and technology and infrastructure goes in to kind of maintain that, versus you could just kind of collapse all that into a single blockchain that everybody operates on, and everybody simultaneously has up to the minute sort of source of truth without any reconciliation processes at all required, and your settlement time gets collapsed from like a few days to a few minutes. And so there's a lot of efficiencies there that can be gained, which then also leads to better customer service. And also it can increase transparency, right? So with when you're posting stuff and executing stuff on a open, public, permissionless sort of system like blockchains are, it increases transparency of the various financial instruments that might be operating on that infrastructure, which then also increases consumer trust in those instruments, which then also overall leads to a better customer experience. So there's all those sort of benefits you get. You also actually reduce systemic risk because as you operate, the cryptographic guarantees that these technologies provide reduce, counterparty risk across different institutions as well as individuals, and overall reduces the systemic risk of the system, and therefore makes a more robust system. So I think there's a lot of ways how these technologies can impact and improve the system today, both from an operational standpoint as well as from a customer experience standpoint.
That's great. So being as biased as I am, I'm really curious to kind of switch over to the Oracle side of things. So one side of that whole equation, of course, is the Oracle space. Really curious. So chain linked protocols, right? Oracle driven information. How does that fit in? Again, a group like Fidelity probably has historically just gotten all of their data directly from individual providers, and I don't think there's probably an Oracle model that's existed in the past there. So you see this world. How do chain-link protocols fit in, and how do Oracles fit into this space?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think so. A couple of thoughts come to mind. So one, when people talk about, a lot of people, in the decentralized space think that everything's going to be decentralized. And I think that's great, but that's not true. There's going to be sort of a hybrid. There's going to be, centralized services will still be required in the future, and a lot of things will become decentralized, which is great. I think, I definitely think that, more things that can be decentralized, the better. But the centralized institution and centralized services will continue to play a role for a very, very long time. And speaking of oracles, like a lot of these smart contracts, you can do rudimentary smart contracts that don't require oracles, but to have really useful smart contracts, especially when you're talking about financial instruments, you need real world data. And the only way you get real world data into a blockchain is through an oracle. And so oracles play today and will continue to play for the foreseeable future a critical role in this whole sort of ecosystem of decentralized technologies and blockchains. And enterprises, have a lot of data that's useful. The enterprises have built trust with their customers, with their brand over decades as well. And so when you're having a smart contract that's executed based on some data feed that's coming in through this oracle, you kind of want it to come from some trusted source. And of course, depending on the use case, you may need a single trusted source, or you may kind of need some decentralized oracle where you're aggregating from multiple trusted sources. Again, depending on what your trust model and your security model and what kind of use case it is, there's all these permutations and combinations, and I think all of them will kind of expand and grow in the future. And so yeah, I think the oracles will continue to play a good role, and even for enterprises, I mean, there's a lot of regulatory issues right now also being in the space when you're completely decentralized, building DeFi protocols or something like that, which obviously enterprises are reluctant until there's regulatory clarity to kind of really offer something, but they can still offer data. So there could be somebody else building DeFi protocols, but they could be pulling in an oracle feed from one of these traditional enterprises. So there's many ways that the enterprises, the startups, the decentralized foundations, and the individual developers, there's this sort of the heterogeneous sort of ecosystem that's being built right now, and I think it'll continue to be built, and certainly oracles, whether they are ranging from a single source of truth, being like single trusted oracle service provider, to, like I said, the aggregate of multiple ones like that, all the way to the completely decentralized prediction market type data coming in to resolve the smart contract. I think that full spectrum makes sense and will continue to grow. And I think that's part of this whole space. We're so early right now that we kind of have a tendency to human brains are pattern matching machines, right? So we look at what's in the past and then we try to look at everything from the lens of what we already know, but there's just so much that we don't even know. And I think that's the most exciting part of to see how these things are actually utilized in the future.
I think your human brain is probably a pattern matching machine. I'm not sure about mine. But, so look, I get this all the time, and I want to kind of dive in. I'm not going to let you off the hook. I want to go one level deeper here because I do hear it's a pretty common question that you get in the enterprise space, or when you go up market, you talk to some of the larger companies. They say, "Look, I already have I have my entire data infrastructure built out over the last 50 years, right? I mean, I've got all this stuff, I've got everything built in, I've got all my databases, I have all my infrastructure, I have all this stuff already done." And they get, well, I see why a startup would want to move to an Oracle model, right? And I think it's really hard for them to get their head around the advantages of moving at least a portion of their services to an Oracle model, right? Or even providing data out to an Oracle model, right? I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but is there a particular data set that you can think of, for Fidelity that would be better to consume, or there are certain apps that you're thinking about that would be better and much more reasonable to get it from an Oracle rather than from your own centralized data inputs?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can speak to any specifics there, but more generally, I mean, again, there's just so much opportunity, right? Like, I mean, to give it an example, a lot of people ask me, like, what are some use cases for blockchains, and what can we build with blockchains or these decentralized applications or whatever? And my response is like, what is the use case for the internet? It's like there's a bazillion things that you could do, and I think it's the same thing applies for blockchains, or where to use oracles, and depending on what specific service you're trying to provide or what specific product you're trying to build, there could be various ways. There's multiple ways to do anything, and what's right for one entity or individual, could be wrong for somebody else. And so it's hard to kind of give you a specific for this product. We use this Oracle or something, but there's definitely a lot of products and services for which using external oracles could be very useful. I mean, even things like, I want to make sure I don't get a call from our compliance folks later. But
oh no, those are the best sessions. If you could go there, that'd be great.
But I mean, so I mean, one thought is around PII, right? So if we could kind of, most big companies, store a lot of PII. That requires a lot of, it's risky. It requires a lot of efforts to make sure everything is super secure, like, because that's the last thing we want to ever, have any sort of risk against, like, that's super secure. But you don't really need that. We need that from a compliance standpoint. Now, in some of these decentralized systems, if you can still provide the same service, same level of service, or even better level of service for your customer, while still complying with all the regulations, while reducing, your effort or operation or risk, I mean, that's great, right? And so I think oracles there's probably many areas where oracles can kind of provide that from a consumption standpoint. And then I previously talked about providing data as oracles, which again, that could be just another service line or even another revenue stream for a lot of existing companies. So yeah, and so there's just so many ways that the big companies, the small companies, the individuals, even governments, like, can all come to play in this new ecosystem. And I think that's part of what makes sense, and what makes sense to consume data from an oracle versus kind of have a centralized repository of data that's more private or controlled, as well as what should be a centralized application, what should be a decentralized application, what should be a hybrid. I think that's what our entire industry is trying to figure out right now, right? Yeah. And I think that the way we figure it out is by experimenting and building and trying, and some things work and some things don't work, and something sparks another new idea that's completely tangential to what your initial plan was. And I think we're so early in the space that over the next 5-10 years, we're collectively going to figure that out as to what are the particular areas where it makes more sense to use an oracle or not.
Great. So I'm going to switch a little bit then. I think when you brought up something which I think is really interesting, which is smaller companies actually being able to play right alongside with larger companies and being able to provide services. And I think of this concept as a middleware, right? If you think of services like Chainlink as this library of services where you can consume data from oracles, you can also publish data out. Whatever blockchain you're working on, you can push it out and anyone else can consume it on whatever blockchain they're working on, as long as you both are speaking to the same node. So is that something that you think is a huge problem today? Like, do you find yourself wanting to get involved in new projects, but you don't necessarily have the in-house expertise on a particular layer one? And is cross-chain compatibility an issue, or just in general, do you share this vision that you at one point can be pushing these Fidelity digital assets, can be pushing services out through this network that can be consumed by anybody, and you could also be consuming services that are built by anybody, and that this is really almost a democratization of sorts of how these two worlds can interact?
Sure, absolutely, right? Like I think this is an analogy that people make often, and I think it completely holds true, which is like what the internet did to information transfer and creation and sharing is what these blockchains and decentralized applications and DeFi and stuff are doing to the creation and transfer of value. And so, in speaking of democratization, we're already seeing a lot of that, right? Like with the just like back in the day. Unless you were affiliated with a large publication like a newspaper or something, you couldn't really, publish or broadcast your thoughts about something. But then the internet came along, and then you could just blog about your ideas and kind of be a journalist. And to kind of analogize that with what you just mentioned with Chainlink, even with that, so the early days was that you had to build your own website, which means you needed some knowledge of HTML and CSS and JavaScript and whatnot. But then you have things like WordPress and Blogger, where it's like you don't need that. You just focus on, writing your message or writing your story, and you don't have to worry about, building the website. And I think that's kind of the service that you guys provide as Chainlink is like, sure, like you could build your own, Oracle service provider and interface with different blockchains, but you guys just make it easier, right? Where you could just focus on what data you want to provide, and just hook up with Chainlink. And I think that's again part of this ecosystem sort of being super nascent right now and growing. So you have, like another analogy is thought of. So even like that's more sort of specific to our space rather than the internet, although the internet is certainly part of our space, is, 2012, you had the altcoin boom. So to back then, if you wanted to make your own coin, you forked the code of Bitcoin and then tweaked it and then kind of had your Genesis block and then kind of made your new coin. And then something like Ethereum comes along where like 2 clicks and you got a new coin, right? So these technologies exist. There are supporting technologies that make it easier for people to play, which further democratizes access. And even if you look at DeFi today with things like, DeFi lending, I mean, that's a service that banks used to provide, and you needed these giant banks with all these different sort of compliance and different processes and, hundreds or if not thousands of people. And now a single individual can just code up a lending protocol and put it out there, and then overnight it becomes worth billions of dollars. So I think that's the democratization of finance. And I think lending is some of the most simplest thing when you're talking about financial services. So I think it'll be super exciting to see as basically anybody in the world, whether they're an individual, a group of friends, small companies, big companies, governments, whatever it might be, like every scale of entity can participate in the space on an equal footing, just like they could on the internet. Except over here, they're creating financial services or even other types of services. But and so the level of innovation, the explosion of innovation, I think is going to be super exciting to see of how they do. And the easier people make it for people to play in this space, and again, to kind of come back to your question about, what Chainlink does. I mean, Chainlink's just making it easier for people to play in the space. And I think that's great. And I think the more tools and the more technologies and the more education really even, the better, because then you get people from diverse backgrounds building things that you could never have thought about, which is, I think, super exciting.
Thank you so much. And that's I really appreciate those thoughts. That's exactly what we're trying to do. And we want to be helping you as much as we're helping anyone else get involved in the space. We are getting close on time here. 10 seconds. You're going to just tell me the future. Can you tell me the next big thing? What's the next big thing in 15 seconds?
I don't know. I mean, I think I kind of just said it, right? Like, I think,
okay.
I think, I mean, I'm just excited to see what happens. I think we're still super early, and I'm just excited to see. I mean, I think one example of like something that couldn't exist, things like flash loans, where you have where you take a loan and pay it back in the same transaction. Like I could never have thought of that before. And I think I'm just excited to see more crazy things that people come up with using smart contracts.
Amazing. All right. Well, thank you again, Raghav. It was fabulous. And we'll leave it there, and we'll hand it back to our host.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you to both of you for joining us. That is an illuminating conversation. I very much appreciate you guys taking the time to come and meet our community. Community, I saw your chat as well. It seems like you very much enjoyed it.